The spring of 1945 smelled of ash and defeat. Across the smoldering ruins of what had once been the world's most feared military empire, the generals of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich were doing something they had never prepared themselves to do. They were surrendering. But here is what makes this story different from any other war story you have ever heard. These men, these architects of industrial slaughter, these designers of the most sophisticated killing machine the modern world had ever produced, were not surrendering with their heads bowed in shame. They surrendered with their chins raised in arrogance, their medals polished, their uniforms pressed, holding the unshakable conviction that they were still, even in total defeat, better than the men who had beaten them. They had spent 12 years at the pinnacle of power, 12 years of being untouchable, 12 years of being saluted by entire nations. In their twisted, deluded minds, they believed the Allies would receive them as fellow gentlemen of war. They imagined leather armchairs. They imagined polite negotiations between professionals. They imagined walking away from the wreckage of 60 million dead human beings with their dignity fully intact. What they found instead was something they were completely unprepared for. They found men who were no longer willing to be polite about what they had witnessed. If you love this kind of history that nobody teaches you in school, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications because we go deep into the moments that actually shaped the world. To understand what happened on that cold Baltic coast in May 1945, we first must understand the man who showed up to surrender as though he were arriving at a state banquet. Field Marshal Erhard Milch was not a small man in any sense. He was one of the founding fathers of the German Luftwaffe, the terrifying aerial war machine that had reduced London, Coventry, Warsaw, and Stalingrad to burning rubble. As the right hand of the flamboyant Hermann Göring, Milch was the engine behind the engine. He was the brilliant, ruthless, coldly efficient administrator who actually made the Luftwaffe function. While Göring preened and postured, Milch worked. He built aircraft production lines. He coordinated logistics. He solved the industrial problems that kept German warplanes in the sky above the burning cities of Europe. And when Germany's war economy began to collapse under the weight of a two-front war, Milch solved that problem too, in the most horrific way imaginable. Working hand in glove with the SS, Field Marshal Erhard Milch oversaw the systematic exploitation of slave labor on a breathtaking scale. Thousands of prisoners, Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, and political enemies were dragged into underground aircraft, factories carved into mountains where they were worked deliberately, methodically, to death. The temperatures were inhuman, the food was non-existent, the violence from the guards was constant. Milch knew, Milch approved, Milch signed the paperwork, and yet, when he arrived to surrender to the British forces on the Baltic coast in May 1945, Erhard Milch did not arrive as a man burdened by guilt. He arrived in an 1845 immaculate, perfectly tailored uniform, every button gleaming, every ribbon and decoration in its correct place. Tucked under his arm like a king, carrying his scepter, was his field marshal's baton, an extraordinary object, heavy, ornate, covered in deep blue velvet, encrusted with gold eagles and iron crosses, the physical embodiment of supreme military authority within the Nazi state. He expected salutes, he expected deference, he expected the professional courtesies that he, in his bottomless arrogance, believed he had earned. He had no idea who was waiting for him. Brigadier Derek Mills-Roberts was everything that Air Chief Marshal Milch was not. Where Milch had spent the war behind desks and in warm conference rooms signing documents, Mills-Roberts had spent it in the mud, in the blood, in the freezing water of Normandy, and in the baking heat of the North African desert. He was a commando, a genuine, battle-hardened British commando who had been hunting Germans since the very first dark days of the conflict, when Britain stood entirely alone, and the outcome of the war was anything but certain. Mills-Roberts had stormed ashore at the catastrophic Dieppe raid in 1942, one of the bloodiest Allied operations of the entire war, where nearly 1,000 Canadian and British soldiers were killed in a single morning on a beach that offered absolutely no cover. He had fought across North Africa, baking under the recess. Merciless sun, learning the brutal mathematics of desert warfare. And on the 6th of June, 1944, he had led the 1st Special Service Brigade off the landing craft at Sword Beach on D-Day, fighting through the chaos and carnage of the Norman coast to link up with the airborne troops holding Pegasus Bridge alongside the legendary Brigadier Lord Lovat. This was a man who had watched his closest friends die beside him, a man who had personally experienced, at close range, the full savage cost of everything that Erhard Milch had helped to unleash on the world. Mills-Roberts had zero patience for ceremony, zero patience for military theater, zero patience for the aristocratic rituals of men who had never once bled for the authority they wore on their shoulders. But it wasn't just the years of combat that had stripped every last fragment of tolerance from Derek Mills-Roberts. It was something far more specific, something that had happened just weeks before this encounter, something that no amount of battlefield experience could have adequately prepared any human being to witness. In April 1945, the soldiers of the British Second Army pushed through the pine forests of northern Germany and stumbled upon something that permanently altered the moral universe of everyone present, Bergen-Belsen. What the British soldiers found inside that camp broke men who thought they, over 60,000 human beings, barely alive, reduced to living skeletons by deliberate starvation, crammed into. These barracks were built for a fraction of that crowd. Hundreds died daily from typhus, dysentery, and the deliberate, calculated deprivation of food and water. All over the grounds of Bergen-Belsen, bodies lay exactly where they fell, left unburied and decaying in the heat of the April sun. 13,000 emaciated bodies, 13,000 human beings were left to rot in the open air. Derek Mills-Roberts walked through those gates and saw mountains of bodies. He breathed an air so thick with the stench of mass death that it clung to his men's skin, hair, and uniforms. It stayed with them for days, no matter how many times they scrubbed. He watched his battle-hardened veterans, men who had survived the worst of war, just freeze, standing completely still in shock, staring, unable to process the horrors right in front of them. Soon, British troops forced the captured SS guards, both men and women, to haul the decaying corpses into mass graves with their bare hands. The rage in the British ranks was not the quick, clean anger of a fistfight. It was something deeper, colder, and far more dangerous. The fury of men who had witnessed the ultimate truth of the evil they fought. As we look at this history, Field Marshal Erhard Milch was brought into Mills-Roberts' headquarters. The room held 2 entirely different species of human experience, standing just 3 feet apart. On one side stood a war criminal in an immaculate uniform, clutching a golden baton, expecting the usual military respect. On the other was a battle-weary commando fresh from Bergen-Belsen. Mills-Roberts began the interrogation with quiet, focused pressure. He stared at the well-fed field marshal and asked him directly about the concentration camps. He demanded to know how Germany's high command could justify what the British had just uncovered, how they explained it to themselves. Erhard Milch looked back at the commando and made the most devastating, foolish miscalculation of his entire life. He genuinely believed he was dealing with a fellow gentleman officer who would share his detached, cold perspective. Milch dismissed the question with a wave of his hand, arrogantly claiming he knew nothing about any death camps. Then, as if chatting casually over drinks, he added that even if these things did happen, it was just the brutal cost of total war. The British, he suggested with supreme arrogance, should not worry themselves over the fate of lower people. The silence that followed lasted exactly 1 second. Mills-Roberts did not offer a verbal reply. Instead, he lunged forward and snatched the golden baton right out of Erhard Milch's hands. Before the German, who could even speak or understand what was happening, the British commando raised that heavy, velvet-wrapped symbol of Nazi power high above his head. He brought it crashing down onto Milch's skull with every single ounce of strength he had. The blow was so incredibly violent that the solid, heavy baton, the very symbol of German military dominance, representing the ultimate height of German military power, literally shattered completely in 2. But the commando was not done. As the bleeding Nazi stumbled backward, Mills-Roberts grabbed a heavy glass champagne bottle from the table and smashed it right over Milch's head. The architect of the German Luftwaffe, one of their most powerful leaders, collapsed to the floor in a heap of shattered glass, broken gold, and his own blood. Guards were ordered to drag him out. Subscribe to our channel for more history. Photos taken shortly after the beating tell the whole story without a single word. The man who had arrived at headquarters that morning as an untouchable, self-styled god king of the German military, pristine, covered in medals, and holding his golden scepter, left looking like a broken mess. His clean uniform was ruined. His baton lay in pieces on the floor, and wrapped around his bloody head was a massive, humiliating white bandage visible to every soldier and journalist nearby. When the command was informed, official protocol demanded they formally reprimand the officer for hitting a prisoner. The reprimand was issued, but it meant nothing. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery heard the full details of what happened, quietly listened in silence, and reportedly let out a small smile. No actual disciplinary action was ever taken against Mills-Roberts. Not a single thing. The unwritten message to the rest of the ranks was unmistakable. The shattered pieces of that golden baton left lying on the tent floor on the Baltic coast in May 1945 were not just bits of velvet and gold. They symbolized the complete destruction of the grand lie the Nazi elite had built and forced the world to believe. The lie that they were honorable, professional soldiers and that their high command was somehow clean and separate from the mass murder being carried out in their name. With full knowledge and his signature on forced labor forms, Erhard Milch faced the Nuremberg tribunals, where he was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity for utilizing slave labor. He was sentenced to life, though later reduced. Milch lived until 1972, while Mills-Roberts lived until 1980, writing memoirs. He never, by any records show, he never expressed any regret for his actions in that command tent. Because the most powerful military baton in the Nazi war machine turned out to be absolutely no match for the righteous, uncontainable fury of one British commando who had looked into the horrors of Bergen-Belsen and refused to pretend that what he witnessed was anything other than absolute horror. The era of the untouchable German field marshal did not end with a trial, a formal declaration, or a carefully written diplomatic document. No, it ended with the sound of a golden baton cracking against a war criminal's skull.